Did you know there's a bird of the year? Or which modern birds carry echoes of their prehistoric past, reminding us of dinosaurs? And what's new in the world of birding conservation? Stick around because we're going to cover this and more in today's episode.
Hey everyone, I'm Lynn.
And I'm Dustin.
And this is Hike Hearth weekly vodcast where we talk about conservation and wildlife and the wonders of the natural world, of course, including birding. Grab your favorite drink and settle in. We are on to the first segment of our new format. Okay, so in our first segment this week, I get to pick Dustin's brain on questions that I have about birding and conservation and wildlife photography as somewhat of a novice in all of those areas. And this week, I have a birding question in particular for him. So, Dustin, I know that you mentioned to me recently that the American Birding Association recently picked the common loon as the bird for 2025. And after you told me about that, I started to wonder, how exactly does the ABA decide what the bird of the year is?
So I think it's a fun question. I'm glad you asked. So one of the main purposes of the ABA is to increase awareness about conservation and issues, and they use the bird of the year to be able to do that. So they use a couple of criteria. The main ones are charisma. They want a bird that is sort of in the public consciousness already and that people are at least a little bit familiar with. They want a bird that has a good conservation story because that is core to their mission. And a bird that's accessible, right? One that everyday people have a chance at encountering in the wild, not something that's, obscure and limited to a small area. And then a couple of minor criteria that really fits for birding in general, which is acceptance. That is, it's a bird that must be an accepted bird inside the ABA area, so it's on the list of birds for that territory. And also a bird that's in the wild, right? So a bird that's alive in the wild and living within the ABA area. So then using those criteria, I'm sure they go to their board of directors and their high-level ornithological contacts for nominations. And then they select it based on how they can put together probably a pretty good marketing campaign that's going to resonate with the public.
Okay, so with all of that in mind, when I think about the common loon, what is it about that bird that made it a good pick for 2025?
Well, it's so iconic. It's definitely a bird that inspires the public as well as birders. And it's a good bird to celebrate because it's so iconic, right? Like if you think of cottage core as a modern style or cabin core for the way people might decorate both their homes if they live in a nature setting, but certainly folks that have second homes or cabins or vacation in places, nothing has more resonance than a common loon. We see that in all kinds of crafting and style and photography. So it's something that folks see, and it's special that to anytime that you see it or that you hear it, you might be on vacation, say in Minnesota or Maine, and just to hear the loon is something that gets everyone's attention. So it's very well known that way. And its call is, of course, hauntingly beautiful. It just sounds unlike any other bird. We're going to talk about prehistoric birds later, but its sound also would certainly fit into that category. And loons are really interesting from a behavioral perspective too. They're incredible for the way that they're really built to swim, right? We think of birds as flying, but their bodies are built to swim. They can swim deep underwater, stay underwater for a long time, catch fish, and they're just striking with their tuxedo black and white plumage. And they face serious conservation concerns as well. Loons have suffered from tons of habitat loss because we've built homes on shorelines and on islands where they nest. They like to nest on islands because they can barely walk, right? I said that they're built for swimming. They're not built for walking. They can just barely walk on land. So they need isolated islands and isolated habitat in order to be able to nest successfully. So choosing the loon is a great way to highlight all of the challenges while engaging the public.
You know what I think is most striking about these birds that I was thinking about as you were talking about them is their eyes. They have those striking red eyes. I can't recall another animal that has that color for their eyes.
Yeah, it's true. So they obviously are. So partly it's to increase their eyesight in low light conditions because they're out early in the morning and in the evening calling and hearing each other. And there's a number of birds that have red eyes, right? Even like the red-eyed vireo has it in their name. But it's very striking in common loons, especially when you can get them with the sun shining just right. Yeah, that's a good point.
So I'm not a hardcore birder, but now I feel like I have a homework assignment because now I want to know like what other birds have red eyes. I'm going to have to look that up this week. This is the kind of rabbit holes I tend to go down. But so it sounds to me that this bird was a perfect choice for 2025. So thank you for answering that question. And for anybody listening to the vodcast, if you have questions about wildlife, nature, conservation, any of those kinds of topics, I'd love to feature one of them in our Ask the Expert section that we're going to do at the start of vodcast. So drop your questions in the comments and your question might be featured in an upcoming episode. But now we're going to get to our featured topic of the week. Dustin, what are we talking about this week?
Dinosaurs.
Dinosaurs. Okay. So I hate to break it to you, but I feel like conservation efforts for dinosaurs failed about, 60 million years ago?
Sort of, but all modern birds are essentially dinosaurs.
Okay. So I've heard that before. Just go on, like while I wrap my head around that one, because that always tends to. Here's another rabbit hole I could go down.
So some dinosaurs were feathered. Okay. And at the Great Extinction Event 65 million years ago, when most of the dinosaurs went extinct, the ones that survived were the smaller ones that either were feathered already or began to develop feathers, because that extinction event created a huge disruption to the world's ecosystem. And for the next 15 million years, from 65 million years ago to about 50 million years ago, we saw rapid evolution of those species into essentially what are the modern bird families today. Lots of evolution continued after that 50 million year part, but that range is where everything branched and dinosaurs went from being the dominant animals on the planet to where birds began to emerge and cover the planet. Even if they weren't dominant in sort of an aggressive way, that's when they really blossomed.
So Emily Dickinson may have not realized it, but she really wasn't kidding when she said hope is a thing with feathers.
That's right. Feathers could have been a key evolutionary trait that allowed birds to continue surviving, or dinosaurs to continue surviving as birds.
Okay. All right. So then our featured topic is dinosaurs or dinosaur birds, or what's your plan? How do you want to walk us through this?
Well, it got me thinking about some birds just look prehistoric. So we're going to talk about 5 of the most prehistoric looking birds we could think of.
Okay. All right. Where do you want to start?
All right, so we basically picked 5 birds, but we're going to start with 3 in the U.S. and then go to a couple more that are international. We're going to start with another iconic bird, one that many people see, which is the Great Blue Heron.
We have those on our lake. We see them all the time here at the cottage.
We do. In fact, and it's late January. The ice is frozen, 9 inches thick, and I saw a Great Blue Heron out there yesterday on the edge of the water. So they're around all the time. But Great Blue Herons have been found in the fossil record, for example, in the La Brea tar pits dating back to perhaps 40,000 years ago. And the heron family itself that it belongs to goes back to 60 million to 38 million years ago. So it certainly falls into that period of rapid evolution. And Great Blue Herons look and sound like pterodactyls. They might be the closest thing that we can see in modern times, and it sounds like a pterodactyl even.
I'm trying to picture like a giant great blue heron now that you said that, because pterodactyls were huge. Can you imagine if we had that size of great blue heron on our lake? There wouldn't be any fish left.
Maybe, or maybe they wouldn't eat fish. We don't know.
Oh, great.
Maybe they'd eat, us. Who knows?
One more reason. So one of our dogs gets very angry when large birds fly over our house, and he barks his head off in the backyard. I'm not sure he would bark if he saw a pterodactyl, though.
Yeah. Not only that, but great blue herons have a prehistoric kind of diet, which might be a key to why they've survived for so long. They'll eat essentially anything they can find. Fish, snakes, eels, chipmunks, gophers. If they can, they have a prehistoric tool also. They basically wear a spear on their face and they spear things and eat whatever they can find. So their behavior, their look, their sound, it's all prehistoric. And they've evolved relatively differently, right? I mentioned that they were here on our lake this week in the dead of winter, 9 inches of ice. They've evolved a little bit differently from a migration perspective too, because I get asked all the time, don't great blue herons migrate? But actually, some of them do. But particularly in the southern hemisphere, the great blue herons down there migrate northward in the winter toward the equator in large flocks. And the first time I was in Costa Rica and I saw a flock of great blue herons flying overhead, it struck me because I'd never really seen a big flock of great blue herons, and I thought it must be some other bird until I realized it was a migrating group, which we just don't have up here. So in North America, our great blue herons largely do not migrate. They really just move toward open water when things freeze. So some of them move toward the coast or to rivers or just deeper into the swamps where there might be some, open water.
And that's interesting that you talk about them flocking, because I was thinking like up here, they behave much differently. At least from my observation, they seem like they're much more solitary. So we don't see a bunch of great blue herons on the lake where we live. We see a great blue heron or maybe two, except like one town over from us in the wetlands area, that's where all of them tend to nest in, I think they're called rookeries, right?
That's right. A rookery is like a breeding colony, and there's a really good wetland with some dead snags up above the water. And here, those got decimated in sort of some ice storms we had in 2009, 2010. They made a really good comeback, but they do nest in communal colonies like that. But they are solitary hunters, and that's why you see them just one at a time on the lake. And one of the things that's really amusing to me is in the late summer, we often get some great egrets, which are communal hunters. And so when we have the great egrets, they try to hunt near the great blue herons, and the great blue herons chase them off, but then they try to come together. It's fun seeing them interact that way.
Okay. All right. That was interesting. So that's bird number 1 out of 5. What is the next bird that we're going to talk about? I'm actually kind of excited for this one.
I'd love to see in comments what came to mind for people for their most prehistoric bird when they thought of this topic. So do give us a chat and let us know. But the second one that came to mind for me is the pelican. And here in the U.S., we basically have 2 kinds of pelicans that we'll talk about. But pelicans have a really long evolutionary history themselves. They go back in the fossil evidence for at least 36 million years. And even though there's, I think, 20-ish species of pelicans around the world, there's 2 in the U.S., the brown pelican and the white pelican. They're essentially the same in structure, but they look different, and in their colors and their behaviors are quite different as well. So they look prehistoric mainly because they've got such a unique long beak with this weird pouch that they use to scoop up food. And they have kind of a prehistoric nonchalance about them. They're really aloof. And they kind of look like they simply couldn't be bothered by the presence of people sometimes because they've been here since way before we were around. But brown pelicans have a really interesting hunting style that's kind of prehistoric itself. They kind of cock their wings back and dive quickly and smack into the water over a school of fish and essentially stun the little fish in the school, and then scoop up all those stunned fish and drain out the water from their pouch to eat those down. And they're super thieves too. They'll steal fish from other pelicans. They'll steal fish from cormorants, that kind of stuff. So they're sort of sloppy that way.
I actually love them. whenever we happen to see one, usually it's when we're vacationing somewhere near the ocean on the East Coast, right? Down, like we've seen a lot of them when we've been down in like Key West or Santa Maria Island in Florida and whatnot.
Not in quite such high numbers, but even as high as the Delmarva Peninsula, that's Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, Delmarva, southward all along the coast, but certainly in big numbers. And, down in Georgia and Florida, you see them hanging out on fishing piers, trying to catch some extra bait fish or some chum from the fishermen and stuff. And a lot of them are very, acclimatized to seeing people.
I don't even know why I think they're so beautiful, but I do. I mean, I've seen a tremendous artwork from a variety of like naturalist artists who have focused from time to time on artwork for pelicans. And I just find them fascinating. And when we do see them publicly, I always yell out, Dustin, there's a pterodactyl.
Yeah, speaking of that, the species plates from Audubon of the different species, the pelican one is really striking. It is actually a good kind of quirky artwork and makes for really good home decor.
Yeah, it's amazing. All right. Okay, so that's 2 out of the 3.
Well, we haven't gotten to the details about the white pelican, which is quite different in terms of its behavior and its territory. So white pelicans are more just sort of the Georgia and Florida coastline, but they migrate up into central and western United States, all the way up into central Canada. So it's really possible to see flocks of pelicans migrating overhead in the western U.S., which I haven't seen, but sounds like quite a sight. And they have a really different hunting strategy where they do not hunt from the air diving into the water. Instead, they hunt in lowlands and wetlands and hunt communally, kind of driving fish into the shallows where they then scoop up the groups of fish that they've corralled as a group. So that's pretty interesting. And they also nest communally in rookeries, similar to the Great Blue Herons that we were talking about. But I came across a quote in the research for this from a legendary conservationist named Aldo Leopold. And he wrote, "Let a squadron of southbound pelicans but feel a lift of prairie breeze, and they sense at once that there is a landing in the geologic past, a refuge from that most relentless of aggressors. The future, with queer and antediluvian grunts, they set a wing, descending in majestic spirals to the welcoming wastes of a bygone age." If that doesn't speak to their prehistoric nature, I certainly can't do any better than that.
Yeah, I love it.
But they've been around for 11,000 years or more. And pelicans are another species that's had been decimated by the presence of DDT and really benefited from the conservation efforts in the 60s and 70s. And that's because DDT, as we know, thinned bird shells. But pelicans have a unique incubation strategy where they don't like lay down on their eggs the way that other birds do. They kind of stand on them and use the webbing of their feet over the eggs to shelter them. And so when the DDT impacted the thickness of eggshells, that strategy began to backfire on them. But we've made great progress in bringing them back. So it's a good conservation story.
Go conservationists for the win.
That's right.
Awesome. Okay. I'm trying to think while you're talking. Like, I know I've seen brown pelicans. Have I seen a white pelican? I don't know if I have or not.
It's a good question. I don't think I have a white pelican on my life list. I'm sure I've seen them in the past. But since I started birding, my own rule for myself was I wasn't going to count it unless I unless I saw it since I became a birder, or I have a few birds that I actually have photos of from before I was a birder that I've come across, and I've counted those. But I don't think white pelicans are on my list just yet.
Okay, so bring us home as far as U.S.-based prehistoric-looking birds. What's third on your list?
I think one of the most peculiar and endearing-looking birds, because of its peculiarity in the U.S., is the wood stork. And the wood stork can be traced as far back as 100,000 years ago, but its family goes back in the geologic record at least 20 million years, maybe as far as 23 million years. So it certainly is actually prehistoric. And it's kind of the closest thing in the U.S. that we have to the folkloric story of stork bringing babies and things like that, which is more prominent in Europe and was tied to like the Hans Christian Andersen fairy tales and things like that. But America has its stork, and it's the wood stork.
All right. So I have to tell you, I saw this on the list for us to record about, and I wasn't really sure what you were talking about until you mentioned a stork delivering babies, because that's really an iconic image, I think so many of us have in our minds when we think about storks. So it's a white bird then. Is that what it looks like?
It's primarily white with a black face and sort of head.
I see. Okay.
And storks in Europe are known for nesting on top of houses, like in the crook of a chimney on the roof in individual houses, the way that great blue herons nest in the dead trees, like we were talking about. So in Europe, there's places where the storks have been really endeared as coming back and sort of being a resident and being paired up with, individual families and stuff. But we don't have that here in the U.S. The wood storks nest in wetlands, up in the trees. And one of my big, regrets as a birder is that I found birding late. I actually went to school in St. Augustine, Florida. And it turns out St. Augustine is one of the best places in all of the U.S. for birding, but particular in for seeing wood storks and some other birds up close, because although there's an alligator farm in Zoological Park with captive alligators and other crocodilian species, the local birds, including wood storks, have discovered on their own that it's a very safe nesting space. So inside the alligator farm, you can go walk on elevated boardwalks within 10 or 20 feet of wood stork nests and observe them up close. And they even allow like a special photography pass to go in early in the morning for photographers and stuff. So that's the best way to see wood storks, although you certainly can encounter them in more natural habitats. Those are native wild birds that nest there. It's pretty fun.
I have a fondness for that alligator park. So the first time my family took me on a long vacation when I was growing up was in first grade. And they took me to Florida and we went to Disney World. But then on our way, before coming home, we stopped in St. Augustine and we went to the alligator farm. And years later, the only thing about that trip that I remembered was the alligator farm. I have no memories at all of having been to Walt Disney World as a child. And it killed my parents. My father was like, we spent all that money taking you to Walt Disney World and all you remember is the alligators. And I'm like, well, of course. I mean, come on. It is a special little place in Florida, that alligator farm, for sure.
Yeah, and I suspect that trip was probably during April school vacation. And
yeah.
If that's true, I bet there were wood storks there when you were there.
Interesting.
One last fun fact about the wood stork is that they have an interesting behavioral technique for keeping their nestlings cool in the nest, which is they'll actually scoop up water in their beaks and swallow it, but regurgitate that water to dump it on the heads of their nestlings to keep them cool in the hot southern sun.
I'm having flashbacks of like my mom like cleaning off my face when I was a kid with like by like licking a napkin and like, I'm sorry, little baby wood storks. I kind of know how you feel in those cases. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, they have a gross water park.
Hey, moms do what they got to do sometimes, right? All right, so those were our 3 from the U.S. Now, you said there were 5, so I'm assuming that the last 2 come from other places in the world.
Yeah, we're going to go a bit further afield, and our 4th prehistoric bird is the Indian gray hornbill. And I was recently shown a picture of this bird from a friend of mine who went home to visit her family in India. And while she was there, she sent me a picture on WhatsApp of the hornbill that they had seen. And her sister, who's an ecologist actually, identified it as the Indian gray hornbill. And I immediately went, that's got to go into our prehistoric bird story. It's just a wild looking bird. It just looks prehistoric. It sort of looks like a woodpecker, but with a big scythe on its beak, like if it was going to like cut you or something. But they have some really cool behavioral features as well. They've been really successful, and they exist all over the Indian subcontinent. And they've been able to adapt really well. So you can see an Indian gray hornbill in like city parks all over India. So it's not a hard bird to see if you happen to be there. It thrives in those environments. And the Indian gray hornbill also has a super interesting reproductive habit. They nest in cavities like many birds do, but the female Indian gray hornbill seals itself inside the cavity for the entirety of the incubation process. So they bring mud and seal up the hole, and the female stays inside there for, I don't know what it is, multiple weeks at a time during the incubation process. And during that whole time, the male brings her food and passes it through the little hole and feeds her for the entirety of the incubation process. So it must be really important to their strategy to keep those eggs warm at all times, I guess.
I just picture her like scrolling book talk and reading her fantasy romances and watching her shows and giving herself facials. I'm sure it's not that pleasant, but that was the image that came to mind to me of a mom being shut in while she's taking care of her babies.
I think you might just be envious of her introversion level.
Maybe a little bit, although I would want to go outside for a walk now and then. Like, yeah, that's got to be hard.
They also play, like many birds, a crucial role in the seed dispersal of the local seeds in their environment. So in various parts of India, too, they hold a really strong cultural importance, and they're featured in local folklore and traditions. They symbolize traits like fidelity and nurturing due to this unique nesting and breeding habitat. So they were a fun bird to learn about, so I thank my friends for that.
Yeah, it sounds like a really unique bird, especially the stuff about reproduction. I thought that was really kind of a striking and unique fact about this bird as you were talking about it. All right, we've got one more dinosaur bird left on the list. So what's the grand finale? How are you closing us out?
This bird just looks unlike any bird you've ever seen, and it's the shoebill.
I know what this is. This is the TikTok bird. This bird's all over TikTok.
It definitely has a face made for a camera. It might not be called pretty, but it's a face made to be photographed for sure. And the shoebill's evolutionary history is also super long, spanning over 30 million years. These birds can be found in sort of a strip in central to eastern Africa. And that geologic history also includes an ancestor called the Goliathia. And that Goliathia was one of the largest birds in the fossil record, like I said, going back probably 30 million years or so. And they're known for a patient hunting style, very much like the Great Blue Heron that we talked about. They'll stand motionless in the wetlands, waiting for prey to approach. And when that happens, they swiftly and forcefully capture that thing in the water, eating whatever they can find in terms of invertebrates, fish, amphibians, and even small reptiles. So the iconic picture of them is kind of standing still and kind of looking straight at you because, you know, that's an important way to see it. They're classified as vulnerable. There's probably only 3,500 to 5,000 individual shoebills left in the world, so they're a common target for birders that go to Africa. And like so many of our birds, they've been impacted by habitat destruction, human disturbance, and hunting once upon a time was a primary threat for them. So they're a bird that, you know, benefits from modern conservation practices. So thanks to our conservation friends in Africa for that.
And hopefully as they become more popular and people who are able to travel to Africa to see them, maybe that will boost the economy in ways that will encourage more and more people to protect those birds.
Yeah, ecotourism is, you know, a primary driver. Birders provide a lot of funds to the local economy, allow the funding of research in different areas, and then, of course, the ongoing maintenance of wildlife areas and refuges and stuff like that.
Interesting. All right. I think that was a really great list. I think seeing any one of these birds now, at least for me, if I have the opportunity, is going to make me want to watch Jurassic Park again, maybe. I might look at that T-Rex in that movie a little differently. Imagine him with feathers. That would be interesting. So one final question that I have in this segment of the vodcast is, so Dustin, if you had the chance, I know you've seen some of these birds, but not all of them. If you had the chance to see any one of these, which one would top your bucket list?
Definitely the shoebill, right? Both because it's probably the hardest for me or anyone to get to unless you already live in Africa, because it's not widespread across a huge area the same way that the hornbill is. And it's just a common bucket list bird. So anytime I get if I ever get the opportunity to go on safari to Africa, it'll almost certainly include some time spent at a place where the shoebill lives. Luckily, if you get to the right place, I hear they're not too difficult to find. They're they stick to a very tight territory and almost never fly more than 1,000 meters or so at a time.
All right. So I think this wraps up our dinosaur talk for the day. And I think it's time to come back through the evolutionary timeline and back to modern times. So I propose we move on to talking about what's going on recently in the world of birding, wildlife, and conservation. Does that sound good to you?
Let's do it.
Okay, so in our next segment of the vodcast's new format, Dustin, for our first story, I heard just before we started recording, you say that you've got some big, exciting news for us. What is it?
Yeah, there's a really great conservation story going on in Hawaii with some partners around the world for a bird called the Hawaiian Crow, or known locally as the Alalā. And we often think of extinction as something that has happened in the past and something that is permanent, which makes sense, but that's not always the case, and there's good work being done for certain species. For example, there used to be 5 endemic crow species on the Hawaiian Islands. 4 of those have been extinct for a while, but the 5th one, the Hawaiian crow, or the Alalā, became extinct or declared extinct in the wild in 2002. But through zoos and conservation efforts, there have been Hawaiian crows in captivity that have been raised in order to be able to be re-released in Hawaii. So last month, in December of 2024, 5 Alalā were released in Hawaii and are now once again present and living in the wild. And this ties a little bit to our earlier story about how the ABA defines their territory. And the ABA area used to not include Hawaii, but in 2016, they decided to include Hawaii. So this now becomes a countable bird. But some birders think, oh, is this really a wild bird because it was raised in captivity and just released? And so there's a little discussion about that, but it depends on what your definition is. And hopefully those now released birds will successfully reproduce maybe next spring. I hope we hear a successful conservation story that they begin to nest. I believe it was 3 males and 2 females that were released. So 1 or 2 successful nesting attempts would be big news in conservation. So hopefully we'll have an update about that. What makes the story even more inspiring is the collaborative effort that was behind it. So this was done with local conservation groups in Hawaii, with the University of Hawaii, and supported by the world-renowned San Diego Zoo and Zoological Park, a place that we visited as a family a couple years ago. And these roles also play an important part in Hawaiian culture, and they have a really distinct call. They're sometimes known as the forest singers.
Oh, I like that. I like that. Yeah, and to the local culture. I was reading up a little bit about these while you were finishing setup for the vodcast today, and they are apparently considered sacred animals in the Hawaiian culture. And, what I love about this story as I'm listening to you talk about it is how it shows people from different groups coming together to protect wildlife. And that's always something I like to see and hear about. So thanks for that.
Yeah, the indigenous Hawaiian culture thinks of them as sort of messenger birds that would carry a message from the chief out to the foot soldiers or the people that are away from the tribe, and often also is depicted as sort of a call from a baby to sort of help draw attention and request the nurturing it needs.
Oh, that's awesome. I'm so glad these birds are back in the wild. That's really cool. All right. So you alluded to the fact that for this segment, you had two pieces of good news. So I'm assuming our next story is also a happy story as well.
It is. So this one's about the red-cockaded woodpecker. This is a woodpecker that has been listed as endangered for quite a while and was recently moved up from endangered to threatened. And this is a bird that's largely in mature pine forest in the southeastern United States. So the same exact habitat where the legendary ivory-billed woodpecker is likely extinct from. And by having conservation efforts to protect that habitat and specifically to help support red-cockaded woodpeckers thrive in that habitat, they've been moved up. So this is just great news.
That is really cool. And it reminds me of like nest box programs that you run in town, for the bluebirds and tree swallows in our area. This idea of having, artificial nesting cavities for birds and whatnot. But you were mentioning before the recording something that's a little tricky about nesting, artificial nestings for these particular birds.
Yeah, a number of birds will take to a human-created nest box or a nest cavity that we've placed into their habitat. But these guys like to nest 30 or 40 feet up in the trees. So it takes a little more effort and funds to be able to securely and safely get those nest boxes up there, a little more effort to monitor them in those situations. But again, it goes to show that quality conservation work is or can indeed be successful when we set our minds to it. For our last segment, we're going to talk about some birding tourism in a place you might not think of, which is Colombia.
Yes. So I thought we could end this week's podcast by talking about one of my favorite topics, which is vacation. And I came across an article on the ecotourism boom, which we've already talked a little bit about in the vodcast when we were talking about the shoe bill. And what countries like the country of Colombia are doing to participate. So I have a question for you, Dustin, on this. Did you know that Colombia is home to more bird species than any other country in the world?
I actually did know this, and it makes total sense. But actually, the whole Central American region is the primary driver of this, and Colombia has two advantages over some of the other countries as well, which is it's simply bigger, right? So if you were to sort of draw a circle around Central and the northern part of South America, Colombia has more territory than all of the countries that are also extremely bird rich, like Costa Rica, Belize, Ecuador, Nicaragua, El Salvador, countries like that. But it has more territory, so it gives it an advantage over those countries. And a lot of birds are elevation specialists, so the mountainous nature of that area is a big contributor, and Colombia certainly has lots of elevations for different birds to thrive at.
What I like about this is the win-win that ecotourism creates, right? Because it's a really great opportunity for Colombia to improve their local economy. But in order to do that, they have to protect the habitat. Otherwise, the birders are going to stop coming. So I do think that's really cool. And, I think there are certain places in the world where people could have concerns about traveling, quite frankly. But you had even mentioned to me recently that there are some really experienced birders who actually come from backgrounds in different places like Central America. And so there is the opportunity to go as part of a tour group where you have a set itinerary and things are kind of set up for you in advance to be successful and safe when you're traveling.
That's right. I was telling Lynn about there's a tour group called Birding by Bus that I've been following on social media for a number of years. And one of the leaders of that is a woman named Eliana, who's from Colombia, and she's got great connections. So her and many other tour groups are now able to leverage the ecotourism and bring people in to be able to know they're going to experience routes with safe itineraries and things like that. So the ecotourism is actually opening up Colombia for more of their economy. Not that security is not a valid concern for lots of people, but there are safe pathways being carved now, which is really great to know.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's also tour groups in the US, there's tour groups in Europe. I even have a friend who saved his pennies for a couple of years and is now taking his family on an eco tour through Africa to do a little bit of safari. And what's great is you have guides that understand the local area and the culture, but also understand the habitats as well, and know how to follow the rules in those habitats to protect them, right?
Yeah, and those countries are now doing a great job at harnessing the power of ecotourism to help fund conservation efforts, because if they preserve it, the ecotourism value to that economy will only continue to grow. I look forward to contributing to it.
Yeah, I know you do. All right. So, with winter in full swing, we've been spending more time indoors, Dustin and I, than we typically do in the spring, summer, and fall. And usually around the cottage, what we're doing is we're playing games, we're chatting about nature, we're reading books, and just kind of hanging out, right, Dustin?
Yeah, by the fire.
Yeah.
But for those things, we're going to start doing a weekly series of live streams, usually Thursdays at 8 p.m., where you can hang out with us and chat about nature, conservation, birding, and whatever else comes to mind.
Even vacation planning, right?
Even that.
All right. You heard him, guys. So I'm going to hold him to that. So what I would say is make sure you're subscribed to the channel and set your notifications. As a little teaser of this upcoming live stream on Thursday night, we're going to be diving into Sibley's Trivia cards. It's a game from David Allen Sibley, who, Dustin, I know you are very familiar with him.
Yeah, he's a preeminent ornithologist of our time, certainly one of the best and most accurate ornithological artists out there. His works are great, and for a good portion of his life, he lived nearby in our part of Massachusetts. So very in tune with his work. I've seen him speak several times.
Absolutely. So I'll be asking Dustin some trivia about birds. And if you do join the live stream, you can help him out in the comments a little bit. We're also going to play a round or two of one of our favorite board games, which we actually have a digital version of called Cascadia, which is a lot of fun. And then what I also thought we'd do, which is a little bit more up my alley, is discuss what's on our to-be-read book pile currently. I have one book that I'm in the process of reading and a couple more lined up. And I know, Dustin, you've been talking about some of the books on your pile. So we can chat about that with all of you guys as well.
Yeah, I love reading in tune with the cycles of nature. So I usually have a book to be read about sort of winter behaviors or things that help me embrace the conditions outside. And always around migration season, reading about birds is a great way to kind of get pumped up for the coming, high season for birding.
And I'm a total chaotic reader who is just at heart a bookworm and book hoarder, and I'm just constantly trying to unbury myself from my to-be-read pile. I typically am reading a nonfiction book, which is usually having to do with natural history. And then I will be reading usually some random fiction. And I'll admit it, a lot of times it's fantasy romance. But hey, a girl's got to do what she's got to do to entertain herself,
Yeah,
right?
And right now we're both enjoying Ken Kaufman's latest release, which is about John James Audubon and the birds that he forgot. So it's really good. Tie into the history of ornithology in the U.S., as well as where the modern science has led to maybe point out some of the things that Audubon missed or maybe had incorrectly. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah. And Dustin's like fired up about this book from the ornithological standpoint. And I love hearing all the little secrets about John James Audubon's life. It's fascinating. He is not at all who I thought he was. And it makes him even more interesting of a person to me, for sure. So anyways, be sure you're also visiting us at hikeandhearth.com. It is our new website. We just launched it a couple months ago. And Dustin has this huge portfolio of photography. So we're digging through that and adding new photography to that website throughout the year. We're also doing a weekly blog post as well. And all right, that's my pitch for the week. Dustin, is there anything else on your mind right now?
Nothing for me. I just want to remind our friends to keep your eyes on the skies and your hearts in the wild.
Bye, everyone.
See you soon.